Okay. Well, welcome and thank you so much for coming out tonight. This is the Liberty Talks for Libertarian Party of King County, and tonight we're going to be talking about taxation, which is a favorite topic of ours. We have two speakers tonight. We've got Glen Morgan, and I will be introducing to him in a moment, and Frank Bown. And so we're going to be hearing what they have to say, and then following that up with a Q&A at the end. I wanted to give you the introduction here, Glen, but I tell you, if I read all of your accolades here...
Just cut to the minimum.
So, are you still with Caper?
Yep.
You're still with Caper? You were the executive director at
Still
one point?
yeah.
Oh, you still are?
Yeah.
Okay, so, and then you're with We the Govern.
Which is my website.
That's your website.
Yeah.
So, why don't I just go ahead and bring you up here and you can
Sounds
tell
good.
everybody a little bit about yourself and take the ball and run.
All right, sounds good.
Thanks much.
All right. As always, Michelle, thank you for the opportunity to come here and chat. Just to make it simpler for people, I just put up on the screen my name and my email and my website. That usually, if you're interested, definitely feel free to go there and take a look at anything that I've put up there and have written. Also, capr.us is the Citizens Alliance for Property Rights website as well. The one thing I'm going to mention is I started my own website when I left the Freedom Foundation in 2015, and it's become a pretty easy way for me to communicate a lot of information out to people if they're interested in the different stories and the articles and the exposés that I have up there. But I started realizing that Facebook and Google have been pretty actively trying to suppress a lot of articles that I've been writing and skewing search results and really trying to reduce the ability of people to access those articles. So if you want to make sure you get them all the time, sign up for my email. So you can just get, whenever the articles come out, I don't spam everybody. It's just whenever there's an article published, you'll get it at 7 in the morning the next day. So at least you'll get a chance to see what I've written, and it'll come directly to you. And so I do want to make sure that you're aware of that. I do try to make sure it's posted up on Facebook. I don't know how long Facebook is going to allow alternative thoughts to be placed on the site. I really see a trend for pretty aggressive suppression of independent thought. So I don't know when that's going to come about or how that's going to be implemented, but the easiest way is still to just reach out and make sure you know where some of this information is coming from. I do want to point out one thing, just so you can see what that looks like. And I'll show you, like, this is what my page looks like. There's quite a few different articles. I've written quite a few different, and I've produced some videos. And it's a way to get articles almost exclusively on Washington State. You don't care what I have to say about Trump, and neither does anybody else. There's 50,000 people out there who write far better than I do and have a lot more interesting and unique thoughts about what's happening in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere. And but there's a shrinking pool of people in Washington State who actually report or even pay any attention to what's going on in local government or state government. 15 years ago, there were 30 reporters in Olympia during the legislative session any given time when they would have a legislative session going on. Now there's 6, and I expect next year to be 3, maybe less. The reality is there's no more media that exists anymore the way we think of it today. I talked to an editor of one of the major newspapers, or at least what's always been perceived as one of the major newspapers in Washington State, from one of the major cities, and he mentioned to me that they don't even have any reporters. They don't print their own papers. Their call centers in the Philippines. There's no reporters left. They don't have a building anymore. There's a couple little offices that they have, and their subscription rates have collapsed, 70%, and they're down to just desperately hoping that you are willing to pay online for what they have to offer. And yet people think that's the media today. There's nobody reporting on anything. So for the most part, I think government's really it's up to us as citizens to step up and do whatever we can to report on what we know about what's going on. The only other thing I'm going to mention is that, so Citizens Alliance for Property Rights has always been my core passion, and I've been involved in property rights issues which overlap with taxation substantially, and that may be logical to an audience of libertarians, but believe it or not, that's actually a substantial movement in this country has been that your money is not your property. And it was recently adjudicated at the Supreme Court in a case called Coons versus St. John's Water District, which was a property rights case out of Florida. And one of the decisions the Supreme Court had to rule on was, is your money property? Is your money your property? Which is a very funny thing that they had to rule on. And they ruled correctly. The only scary thing about that ruling was that it was a 5-4 decision. So we actually had 4 Supreme Court justices at the time who actually believed, and unfortunately I think all 4 of those are still there, who actually did not believe that your money was your property. And then in that case it was a property rights case, but it also, I think, I might come back to that to discuss some of the issues related to litigation and how that's not always the path to solve a lot of the problems that we might have when it comes to freedom and restoring a lot of our liberty-oriented issues that we have in the state or the country. The other thing I'm going to mention, just because I'm in front of this group here, I am doing a tour around the state. I've done this before when I was at the Freedom Foundation. This time I'm doing it with Tim Eyman. Tim and I are different, but we're both activists. He's an initiative guy. And when it comes to taxes, my personal opinion is that there is nobody alive in Washington State that saved you more in tax dollars than that guy with his direct actions. So not just in pretending and keeping a seat warm in Olympia, but somebody who's actually gone out and done actively things for 20 years that have directly impacted how much you pay in taxes today. And so the thing is, it's funny, I've known him for years. We've crossed paths a lot, but for the first time we actually were on stage together speaking up in Whatcom County last October. And it was an interesting dynamic, and we were talking about different issues, but there were some things that were fairly complementary in that process. And so because of that, we kind of talked, hey, why don't we do a tour around the state? He's never done it, but I've done it quite a few times. So we're starting in May. We're going to start in Whatcom County. We're doing a number of stops all around the state. It's going to be called the Full Contact Activism Tour. Because it's one thing to say that you're going to be an activist, and it's another thing to get out there and actually do it. And so we want to hopefully inspire more people to be active. My issue and involvement with taxes overall, taxes have, most people I don't think would dispute, certainly not in this room, but also if you go in front of any conservative or Republican area, you would basically agree with me with a statement that we're paying too much in taxes and that too much of that money gets squandered and wasted, and that in fact what does get spent is oftentimes spent on things that we don't want, and even more pernicious, it oftentimes gets spent on things that's used to abuse us one way or the other. You're generally going to agree, at least most people are going to agree, that I am happy to pay for the taxes that would support a stable justice system in theory. Now, we can argue about whether we have a great justice system, but in theory we have a justice system there, and we want courts, we want judges. We don't want people settling disputes in the streets. We want to have a predictable rule of law, and therefore that's probably worth funding. People won't dispute that. We want a fire department that would come out and keep my house from burning down, and as a community we'll get together and say, you know, we're going to support that. Or a police department perhaps, or whatever it is that you've agreed as a community to come together and support. There's a lot of those issues that are less controversial. They may be debated in libertarian circles, and as a libertarian small L, ever since I was in college, I understand that because I've had those debates just like you have. But as far as across most of the population, even amongst the conservative population, those are generally going to be things that people will say they support. The decline of support of use of your taxes starts to appear in areas like things like the Puget Sound Partnership, which is just a nepotistic little organization that was funded. 20 million of your tax dollars get squandered on it every day, and or every year. And the organization spends most of its time finding ways of extracting more of your tax dollars through grant money or perhaps new regulations that they can pretend to justify their existence by imposing on you. Or it could be your code enforcement locally, where every day they go to work and try to find ways to ruin people's lives. Or your planning department, which pretty much spends its whole time finding ways to destroy your community, ensure that there will be no affordable housing, and to make that process of building housing as miserable and as destructive to your life as you possibly can get. And that doesn't include the way that your taxes are squandered and wasted when government actually gets it wasted. And I mean, it's kind of, you know, it's repetitive. The problem is that bureaucracy and our taxes are used mostly to fund and continually prop up a bureaucracy that exists primarily to perpetuate itself. And that is the nature of bureaucracy. And it isn't an evil conspiracy. It isn't something that a bunch of people got together in a room, you know, even at the Department of Ecology, which is a terrifically terrible organization in almost every way. And despite how worthless and useless the people are who work there as far as what they do, they didn't all get together and say, hey, our goal is to make life as miserable as possible for the people of Washington State. Most of them go there, and they actually are probably not terribly ideologically oriented. They just want their paycheck. They want more of it. They want to take 2-hour coffee breaks, which I encourage they do more often, because the more they're in their office, the more damage they do. So that's better that they waste it on coffee breaks, or whatever. But anyway, they don't go there just thinking, we're conspiring to make life miserable. They just realize the only way to ensure you move up the food chain of bureaucracy is to expand the number of laws and rules that you have, the number of employees who work underneath you, because that's how you move up the food chain, and that's how you get paid more. And that fact of life, as far as nature of man, ensures that bureaucracy will always exist to perpetuate itself. The same thing happens in big businesses, but it's just that government's funded by our taxes to get there. So
you think they start out with good intentions?
No, not always, but I think the average bureaucrat, and I live in Thurston County, 52% of the people who live in Thurston County are either directly employed by the government or they live with somebody who is.
What was that percentage?
52% of
52%?
Of Thurston County, because every state agency is located there. You have local and state county government, and you also have a lot of the federal governments, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, all those guys, they all tend to be located in that area. And so it's the biggest concentration of bureaucrats as a percentage of the population in the state. And so, and there's also some Fort Lewis support too, so you have some government people that are right there. And so I know a lot of these bureaucrats. I meet them all the time. They're my neighbors. They're the same soccer team. My kids, their parents. I get a chance to talk to a lot of people that are in the bureaucracy. I've doorbelled the county many times, and I've been to their homes and met a lot of these people. And I don't think the majority of them get together with bad intentions with what they're trying to do. Now, there's certainly senior leadership and other elements that certainly do have bad intentions, I think, within government. But the average bureaucrat doesn't have they don't have bad intentions. They're just trying to get the most for themselves and have the most stable job they can possibly have when they leave. And they really don't care what they're doing to you on the way out the door, because that's just not their problem. Also, I don't think people can really underestimate the ability of humans to just self-justify almost anything that they do. There's always justification for what people do. And human history is filled with these examples, and it's no different today. My first run-in with taxes really had to do, I ran for the assessor's office in Thurston County. Absolutely the most exciting position ever created in government. And it was my first foray into running. I'd helped in political campaigns when I was in college. It was the first time I ran for a big political office. And the thing about that was interesting is I ran out of frustration, which is the same reason that a lot of people try to run for office the first time. They're frustrated with something that's going on. For me, my dad, I live next to a lot of family members where I live, and we're rural. And my dad had been appealing his property taxes in Thurston County, and every year he would prevail on the assessed value. He'd prevail, and it would be brought back down to the proper value. And then every year, the next year, the government would set it back at the incorrect value that they had just lost the year before at the Board of Equalization hearing. And he had done this for 9 years in a row. Consistently and without exception, he had won every single time. The county had lost every single time, and the county every single time set it at the wrong value. So my platform was that government should be able to get something right at least once a decade. And with that high expectation, I ran and I got close to 48.1% in Thurston County. As a Republican, by the way. I did run as a Republican. And nobody in the Republican Party knew who I was. I was a new guy showing up, and you learn a lot when you run. Thurston County is not a small county. It's not like King County, but it's a fairly large county. It's bigger than running for Ledge District. There's a lot more voters in that county. But it was a good experience to run for that. Now, the next time I ran for school board the next year and was elected pretty easily on my school board, and I served on that school board for 5 years. I was actually elected twice there. I've been involved in running a lot of races, running for a lot of races. And one of the other things that I also did in regards to taxes is, you talk to a lot of people. How many of you have paid attention to how many Prop 1s or levies or all these different little sub-slices of the pie, new levies and fees that they find a way to add to your either property sales or other taxes that they add on? If you've really gone through and looked at it, it's a phenomenal laundry list of taxes. In our state, we actually have to vote on a good percentage of them, which is a good thing, because that's constitutionally mandated in our state constitution, and it's a good thing to be able to vote on those taxes. The challenge is that who's got the incentive to go out and oppose a tax increase? And the truth is that very few people are willing to run a full-blown campaign to oppose a tax increase, and people like Tim Eyman are unusual. Or every now and then you can stir up the pot and get people to oppose a tax, but most of the time the people who have the incentive and the money to push for taxes are those who are going to profit and benefit from it. And so they will, whether it's for a school levy, like in Kent, they will just flat out lie. The Kent School District lied. There's no doubt about it. The district put out a completely false statement that pass this levy and we will keep education levels at the same level. And what happened? The day after I should say a couple weeks after they passed the levy, which it passed in Kent, they went and slashed all their services. I mean, now that's a beautiful example, and somebody should roll, right? All those kind of things happen. But that's the story that many of us in this room have probably seen or heard many times. So the times that I've helped people who have actually been able to destroy or stop or prevent these taxes from happening, it really took a campaign. But I think one of the things we have to remember is that there's messaging that we're really failing on our side to present. And I want to give you one example from last year in Jefferson County of a tax increase that had all the feel-good, kumbaya, bluebird butterflies, and sunshine sales pitch that every single tax always has, that's always put on our ballot or presented to us. And it was a homeless tax called Prop 1 out in Jefferson County. And it was going to save the world, of course, and ensure that homelessness was going to end tomorrow by the logical use of making it more expensive to live in your home. They were going to impose a property tax. And so after making it more expensive to live in your home, the assumption is that the people they just made homeless, that they would have housing that they could put them in. That was the theory. Jefferson County has never shot down a property tax in their history that I can find, at least for the last 2 or 3 decades. The county is the second most leftist county in the state of Washington. King County is a conservative mecca compared to Jefferson as a percentage. It's a small number of people, but as a percentage. You can go back and look at the votes. Trump got 36% or 34% there. You know, it's not exactly a conservative area. But some people who were, God, they're just like you. I mean, no different than anybody in this room. And they decided they wanted to oppose this tax. So the messaging in the campaign that they ran was, love your neighbor, vote no on Prop 1. That was their message. And every week, sometimes multiple times a week, they would do a personal story about somebody in Jefferson County who was going to lose their home, lose their rental, become homeless, have their life made more miserable, or in some way affected significantly by this tax. Every day, relentlessly. They didn't sit there and argue, like most people on our side do, about the percentage calculations or all the stuff that basically creates mind blur, and particularly with students coming out with Common Core. I don't expect most of them to understand the mathematical analysis of tax policy, but it's also ineffective communication. They communicated emotionally the impact in their community that this tax was going to have. And the thing about this is at the end of this campaign, they were fearless. And that is something that we've got to be on our side. We've got to be fearless. They were willing to stand up and confront. They ran a sign campaign just like you would do anything else. They spent very little money, but they really were organized. And the other thing they were not afraid of doing was going in and confronting and exposing the incompetence and corruption in government. And I know that's synonymous, but it's just one of the things that they did. And this is what these homeless program folk do. There is no more egregious group of people squandering your money, other than the environmental movement, than the homeless service entity groups that you have in this county. King County, you see it all the time. But I'll give you just one example that Jefferson County had that was, this is the kind of stuff that we have to do. If you want to prevail, these are the kind of things you have to do in your community. The geniuses that ran the homeless program in Jefferson County, in their infinite wisdom, decided that they wanted to put up an 8-plex low-income housing, subsidized housing unit in Jefferson County. Rather than build it, because there's nothing more evil than building a building, they thought they would go up to Canada and pick one off and stick it on a boat and barge it down and then get it off the barge and go up and put it in a place in Jefferson County. And they said it was going to cost about $160,000, and they figured that was a lot less than it normally would cost to build anything there because their permitting costs were so ridiculous, right? There's no way to build a house for anything near that. So they promoted it as a $160,000 project, but of course, like every program that any of us in this room have ever looked at, it ended up costing $1.6 million to get the exact same building there. And again, with the wisdom and genius that tends to come with people who've been in bureaucracy, $1.6 million.
What was the original?
160,000. It was exactly 10 times more than what they had said. Just added a 0 to the program.
Oh.
Now, but to make it even more, to show how wise and smart, because we only put wise and intelligent people into bureaucracy, they forgot to get a permit for the building, and they forgot to run sewer and water and power to the site. And so it sat up on pallets. It was actually up on these big, high suspended pallets because they also decided to put it on a hill, which is really safe. in seismic territory. So it's resting up on those pallets, literally just, if you've ever seen it, just sitting there month after month after month after month.
Is this a true story?
Yeah, there's photos and articles, they wrote all about it. But this is what they did. So the people who were opposing it, what they did is they went and they got the information. It wasn't just going out arguing and saying it's a bad thing. But they went and got the facts and exposed the truth with public records requests, going to the site, taking photos of it, and just showing the absurdity and the foolishness of the same geniuses that are supposed to take your hard-earned tax dollars and now supposedly solve all the world's problems with it. The tax lost overwhelmingly. It was defeated. It was over 70% opposed in that county. Interestingly enough, if you go back and look at the voter turnout last year, Jefferson County had one of the highest voter turnouts in the state. And they lost all but I think they lost all but one precinct in the end when they counted down. This isn't a county that has never rejected a tax increase under any scenario ever. It didn't matter how bad or stupid or foolish it was. They were stunned. They had every single elected official, with no exception, support it. Every business group, every Kiwanis club, every little group of people that got together and called themselves an organization, everybody supported it. And yet it was defeated overwhelmingly.
How many people were working on that campaign?
6.
Wow.
Six that were really active, and then probably another, outside of that, it was probably like another 30 or 40 people that were, sort of
And what
involved.
did they spend?
A couple $1,000.
Really?
Mostly on signs, yeah. You can go back and look at it. It's not a secret. PDCs are pretty accurate, judging from the guy who files all the complaints. But so it was interesting just from, I only use that example because it's not an impossible thing. And I've watched this happen in Bonnie Lake. I've watched this happen in other jurisdictions. But it was interesting seeing that happen in a county like that, where the standard approach that the conservative / libertarian / Republican people, the theory was that it's a hopeless cause, it's worthless, why bother, we've never won, we've always lost, so let's continue to lose, right? That's always been the attitude. But what happened is some new people moved into the community, who just didn't have that attitude, and then everybody got inspired, and you really see things changing. Incidentally, and purely by accident, they actually elected some conservative people to the port and to the hospital district, who would normally never have a chance on the ballot, but the voter turnout was so high, and people were so upset about the tax increase, they voted for the non-establishment people, and that's what happened. And I'm going to give you just another quick example before, I know my time is running out, I'm opening this up for questions later. I'm from Thurston County, and I grew up in King County, 5th generation Washingtonian, and this is where I lived. I actually grew up in what used to be, or before it was Newcastle, that was our farm, my dad's farm where I grew up. We did move to Thurston County if we'd planned ahead and we realized what politically the scene looked like. We should have moved a little bit further to Lewis. But we moved to Thurston, and then I discovered just how bad the commissioners were down there. And we had terrible commissioners, universally people that should never be allowed to run a coffee shop, let alone government. And all three were bad. And so I got involved in the opposition to them, right? And we ran very traditional campaigns and lost. We didn't beat them until 2012. And it seemed like a hopeless cause, and I've been out doorbelling for years, thousands of signs, hitting the community very hard. But what really started to make a difference there was just exposing the truth. My website that I had up here, at the time I was writing for the Freedom Foundation, all I would do is write stories about the truth about what was going on. Not 2-paragraph rants, because Glen Morgan's not important enough, and I'm not smart enough to write something that's so amazing that's going to change the world. They were mostly focused on investigative sort of research, public records information, attending the meetings, doing the boring stuff to collect the truth. And the truth is so bad that by exposing it, you can change people's mind about what's going on. And in 2014, we had a shocking race. We bounced one of the incumbent commissioners out. It was really amazing. Everybody couldn't believe it. So 2016, the Democrat Party was gearing up again, and they were bringing in some new blood, and they checked all the right little demographic boxes that they had for these people. And in fact, I was told that it wasn't going to be an election. It was going to be a coronation. They were very public about that. The Republican Party was invisible. And whoever the Democrat person was that was going to be on the ballot, that was it was going to happen. It was going to be that person because it was a coronation. And it's not an election in Thurston County. And we had some independents that wanted to run. And some good independents that were running for office. Not perfect. And it was a stunning upset for the Democrats to lose every seat on that commission. And in fact, there are no Republicans there either. They're all 3 independents. First time in state history. It's never happened before. The entire county commission was flipped. And you have a council structure in King County, so it's a little different when you're in a commission structure, but there's only 3 elected officials who are the executive, and they were all flipped. And I have to tell you, that was a shocking event in Thurston County, considering that 52% of the people who live there are bureaucrats or married to one, and that the county went 39% for Trump. It's not exactly Trump land. This wasn't a conservative wave. This was a bunch of people who called themselves Democrats, or at least that's nominally who they were, maybe, who decided that they were sick of it, and they voted for Hillary Clinton, and then the much more conservative people into office for local government. And I can only attribute that, not because they were so amazingly great people, they were good candidates, I'm glad we got them in, and not because their opponents were so flawed. They were pretty typical, classic Democrat establishment people, right? It's because the community finally, after years of just pushing this information out there, exposing the truth about what's happening, it finally sunk in deep enough that that message got across and people were tired of it and they wanted an alternative. And a lot of it's just doing something like this, having a website up like this. It is the lowest cost effort you will ever make in politics to oppose a tax, to change the way your community views things, to do investigative reporting, to do anything you want. And the great thing is when you have your own site and you're doing it, and hopefully you have some control over yourself, but you're able to do it in a reasonably good enough way. It's usually best as a team kind of effort. But nobody's there telling you what to do. You don't have a big organization telling you this is the way every little nuanced message needs to come. You're able to just expose the truth. And I can put up source documents. I've had articles up there with over 1,000 pages of source documents, videos from commission meetings, right? That it's, a lot of people won't like my articles, but I've never had anybody dispute them as being factually inaccurate because I provide all the source, or at least never successfully. I've had all the source documents there. You can say that that's not what happened in the commission meeting, but I've got the whole thing videotaped, so you can interpret it your own way, but that's what I quoted is pretty accurate, or that document's linked in there. So I think that the one thing that we oftentimes fail to realize is that there are practical things that we can do as activists to stop taxes, to shrink the size of government. You know, one of the first things that these commissioners did is they fired many of the managers. They fired 3 managers in less than 12 months. In my world, that's a good thing, you know, and that's an effort. They shrunk the size. They actually cut the budget on several departments in the county, probably the first time for a long time. And so anything that moves the ball in our direction is a good move. And anything that achieves those results that's practical, I think is worth looking at. And one of the things that my friends who are libertarians and those my friends who are conservatives and many of us who have our own way, we want to get out there and be active or make a difference, we oftentimes won't sit down and just take the kind of grind away approach at activism. And doing something like this is very practical. It's not glamorous. It's not as exciting as going to a rally. It's not as glamorous as doing maybe YouTube videos sometimes, although I like videos. I think the video is a very powerful tool. It's just grinding away in your local community, and that's where you can make a difference. You know, and you can make a much bigger difference in your local community than you ever will at the federal level. 6, 7 people can change a county, city easily. You can actually change some of these places with a small group of people, make a big impact there. Your impact in Washington, D.C. is almost negligible, you know, compared to that. So and if you make a big difference locally, then I think the differences really sweep across the state. How am I doing on time? I just want to...
Oh, you're fine.
Okay.
I was just going to maybe ask you, just for the people that are watching.
Sure.
You know, you mentioned that there's, you know, practical things that people can do.
Sure.
Can you make maybe 3 suggestions for people that are watching?
Sure, yeah, so
what could they do in their community?
Right, for practical solutions, to get focused on a governing body or entity where you live, that's your passion. One of the mistakes that I think activists oftentimes do on the more center-right side of the world, libertarian side of the world, is we try to be all things to all people. We have a laundry list of beliefs, and we want to hit every one of them. And that's not a practical approach to solving problems in your local community. We also tend to be more, we tend to look at things very intellectually in the sense that I have this more libertarian view of the world. This is where I'm trying to get to, and we're not taking that down to the practical level, which is at our local city council meeting or someplace like that, where frankly that's where all the change occurs. If Washington, D.C. was nuked tomorrow, no one in this state would notice. You wouldn't. Not unless somebody told you.
It would show up on my Facebook feed.
Yeah, I mean, it just nobody really notices that, and that's an extreme statement. But I want to I say it for a reason. It's 3,000 miles away, and your police would still show up every day. Your electricity wouldn't go down. Nothing would really happen from a day-to-day, how it affects your day-to-day life. But if your city hall, if you don't have a municipal court, if your police department goes away tomorrow, and your fire department goes away, and you lose power locally, that is an impact in your community, and that affects your daily life. And all those decisions that affect most of those things, I'm being very simplistic when I say this, but it's quite true, those things are all controlled and affected locally. And yet, how many times do you go to the city council meetings? Do you even know what's on the agenda? You know? Do you even know who they are? Do you know who the senior bureaucrats are? Do you know who they're married to? Do you know the businesses that their family runs that are profiting from the city council meetings? Do you know what projects they're planning to put on their next comp plan Vision 3040, you know, or whatever they're trying to organize? Do you know how much money they lost last year because they just can't find it? You know, I mean, do you know how many times how much did they promise to spend on that road, and how much did they actually spend? All these kind of stories, these exist, and it's like a Christmas tree of incompetence at every single government. There's a Christmas tree of idiocy and incompetence, and it's waiting to be found. Don't accept that there is zero media. There's zero media presence in any of these places, with the exception of Seattle and sometimes the King County Council. Don't assume there's anybody left in the media looking at any of this, and if they are there, oftentimes they're already corrupted in their own way. They don't want to report on the subjects the way we would probably want to look at them, small government, tell them the truth, whatever. So think about the difference that you can make if you are the resource actually exposing the truth, putting up stuff, not lying, not exaggerating, you can spin it if you want, but you better have the facts to back up what you're saying, and present it consistently and regularly over a period of time. Pretty soon you become the archive and the resource for what's going on. So I think that that's the most practical. Just, you know, get focused on something locally. If you can't change City Hall, I don't know why you think you can change the state, and I sure as hell don't know why you think you can change the federal government. Change it, make it change locally. We just did this in CTAC. Every single Democrat on that council got bounced out. Now, I'm not a big DNR guy, but I'm saying CTAC is not exactly Stevens County. It's the 5th poorest city in Washington State. It's a majority-minority city. By all definitions, the Republican Party abandoned it 3 decades ago. They didn't even know it was on the map. Frankly, actually, they didn't even know that the election actually went positively for them when it happened on November, because nobody was paying attention. And it was just a group of activists who were concerned about their city. They didn't run strong as rah, 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 I'm a party label. They're all nonpartisan positions for whatever that means. But it was and it included the smallest percentage of the reform group that was trying to take over the city council successfully. The smallest percentage that they got, despite the fact they were outspent 8-1, despite the fact that every union opposed them, despite the fact that every established politician opposed them, they were outspent 8-1 on average. And the lowest percentage they got was 58% on the election. That was 2015, and then the last couple people got swept out in 2017. It entirely flipped the whole city council. Again, not Stevens County. This isn't Kettle Falls. You know, this is SeaTac, you know, overflow, you know, it's a dumping ground for Seattle, right? I mean, it's a difficult place to run a political campaign, and they did it. And to some extent, we just wanted to do it to show you can. It can be done. And to think that it can't is just not thinking outside the box. You can't head-to-head, perhaps, the opposition. But you have to approach it in a unique and a different way. It's just like any kind of other innovation. Approach it differently. But think local. You know, I think globally, act locally, right? That totally applies to freedom and liberty-oriented policies. I preached that for 8 years as evangelist for liberty. It's just think globally about liberty and freedom, but act locally to implement it. And when you do that, the ripple-up effect is significant. And I'm just going to tell you right now, in the last 6 years, Thurston County, Mason County, Cowlitz County, Grays Harbor, Pacific, Kitsap, Pierce County have all shifted notably to becoming more conservative. Sometimes that's obviously Republican, sometimes it's not, sometimes it's independent, really don't care. It's just who gets in those offices. But those 7 counties, there's unambiguous, clear evidence that those counties have shifted, at least from a partisan affiliation, but you're seeing it now in policy, to become more conservative, more freedom-oriented, smaller government. At least it's trending that way. And there's no accident that the 19th Ledge District suddenly changed for the first time since the 1930s. This isn't an accident. This is happening because people are taking over and responding to government issues locally, and then it's starting to move up into the higher levels of office.
When you say conservative,
Mm-hmm.
are you referring to economics or social issues?
Mostly economics, mainly because I doorbelled Thurston County as the assessor. There were 2 questions I had asked of me pretty frequently that have absolutely nothing to do with the assessor's office. First one is, are you pro-life? A very irrelevant question to any of the policy things I would ever be dealing with when I was running for office. And the second question had to do with guns. Are you pro-gun? And as it turns out, I'm pro-life and pro-Second Amendment. And I would always tell them the truth. This is who I am. But I would say I really just don't think I'm going to have any influence on that policy area as assessor. It's just not going to happen. And I started asking people, why do you ask that question? Because that's a good question, right? Why does a voter, you go to the door, you doorbell 3,000 homes, not an exaggerated, inflated number, a fact, 3,000 homes, and it was just one of these questions that would come up every 20 homes or so, somebody would ask me that. And the answer I got actually twice in a row, and I stopped asking after that because it made sense. It was the same, I got the same answer. And there were two related answers that they would give. One was, they said, listen, today you're running for assessor, but you're going to build up a resume, and tomorrow, next year, 4 years down the road, you can be running for the legislature. And if I don't agree with you on that issue, if you're anti-gun and you're going to be in the assessor's office, I don't want you anywhere near elected office. I want you to never get in there. And by the way, I never had anybody ask me that who was anti-gun, and I never had anybody ask me that who was not pro-life, frankly. I never had anybody ask that question who wasn't in one of those camps, because the people who are most motivated on that issue tend to be on the pro-life or the pro-gun side of issues, just who ask the questions. And I was doorbelling not conservative areas. I was purposely doorbelling more liberal areas, at least how I viewed the county, based on the demographics of the precincts. And the other answer that somebody said is, and this is the one that will infuriate libertarians and people who are more policy-oriented, right? They said, how you stand on that issue is all I need to know about how you stand on all the issues, right? And that was the answer that they gave. It doesn't matter that that's not true. It's reality. You can deny it. You can pretend that the sky's not blue, but that's how people make decisions. Not everybody, but there's a percentage of them that do. And that's why they ask those questions. However, when I measure conservative, for the most part, I'm usually looking at it more from a fiscal, because it's a nebulous term, right? I'm looking at it from a fiscal, smaller government, less government, more freedom sort of oriented process. And because nobody's cookie cutter, no politician's cookie cutter, and frankly, people get in there and they say one thing and they do something else, and but there was a commissioner in Cowlitz County right now, I'm blanking on his name, just got elected a little while ago. Clearly a conservative, small government guy, and fearless, completely fearless. There was another commissioner in there who was semi-conservative, and then there was a commissioner who was clearly much more on the left side of the equation. So that one vote changed it. It shifts policy. And the first thing they did is they eliminated their low-barrier housing shelter in the community. Now, I'm telling you, that is a controversial step if you've ever been around. They were mobbed at every meeting. It was the end of the world. It was the destruction of humanity, right? It was every single special interest in the world that was for the homeless lobby mobbed them. Every article in the paper was negative. All the business groups were negative. What an evil, terrible, horrible person you must be.
And it was going to warm the earth.
And it was going to, yeah, the earth was going to, the tide was going to rise, animals were going to go extinct. It was the end. And it was mobbed. I mean, it wasn't like there was no opposition. And, but they did it. He pushed it forward and they closed it down. And it was interesting because he had friends that he had worked in this it was a Salvation Army group, and he'd gone out and talked to him beforehand. And he said, hey, are you guys ready for this homeless shelter to go away, this low-barrier homeless shelter, which means you can be on, you can be on drugs, or you can be drunk, or you can be a criminal or sex offender. That's where you can stay. And there's no rules about what you need to, you don't have any behavioral restrictions on living there. And when it shut down, the number of people in the food kitchen in the community dropped by about 20%. And all measures of crime suddenly dropped in the community within days. And it was a sharp drop, and now the crime statistics, property crime, assaults, rapes, mostly property though, car thefts, everything, suddenly had a big drop off. It was the right choice. It was a good decision for the community. And so there were several interesting things that he did. He was totally fearless about it. He was willing to do it. The guy was born in Venezuela, and he absolutely knew what socialism looked like. And he was absolutely unafraid to oppose it. And those are the kind of people that we need in government. We need people who are willing to be fearless, and they're willing to confront. And they're willing to grind, right? It's frustrating over time if you're trying to always confront the other side. And the other side is defined. It isn't D and R. It's the establishment. It's the bureaucracy. It's, the biggest party is the party of bureaucracy. It's not about Republican or Democrat. It's this party of bureaucracy that doesn't really care what party or who's in elected office. They think they're going to outlast you anyway. And if you're willing to take on the Leviathan, the state, and actually shrink it, in my book, you're on the right side of the equation, whatever label you've given yourself. And so that's oftentimes how I try to measure who I think is getting elected office. And we have, you know, I was involved in a Douglas County race, all Republicans. Everyone's a Republican, supposedly. And, but I watched some reform-oriented people come in and flip out some established, worthless people that shouldn't be in office. And it was nice to see that change there, too. So it'll happen. I'm not really caring that much about the label so much as what are they actually doing when they get in there. Now, sometimes they get in there and they get corrupted by the system or they get lost along the way. This is not a perfect process. Yeah, most of the time, over time. The longer you're in there, it's very hard to avoid it, right? You start talking like a bureaucrat, you interact all the time with bureaucrats. How many times have you spent electing somebody to office and then you don't pay any attention? Do you go to the meetings after they're in there? Maybe you went to the swearing-in ceremony, but you probably didn't go in there after them. Every day, the bureaucrats are talking to them. Every single day, usually multiple times a day, all the time. And if nobody on our side's going in there, then...
So Glenn,
Yeah.
you working in that environment, sort of the swampy environment,
Yeah.
how do you stay clean? How do you stay straight and keep yourself?
Me personally or other
Yeah.
people?
Yeah, because I mean.
Well, I'm not in elected office, so it's easy. And I mean, this is something too, activists, which is this room that's going to be filled with, right? We're the ones that, we're not, it's easy to say that a politician must do these perfect things, and this is your perfect policy suite, and that you think if you get into office that you would do all those things exactly the way that you say. And then you get in there and you find out it's not quite that simple. There's compromises you're going to have to make sometimes. It doesn't mean you compromise what you believe, but there's practical compromises you're going to get just to try to move the ball forward. And the challenge is to have, and so it's easy for me to say this is what you need to do. I can stay focused, right? I can be the hardline guy, always focus on those issues, but the politicians have a harder time, I think. And so you have to be there working with them. And the other thing is, it's a risky thing. Libertarians oftentimes have this issue, but they aren't alone in this, and that is the purity test. You know, purity, we want somebody to be absolutely pure. They say they're a conservative or they're libertarian, they must be pure on all the issues. And that is no less extreme a position than somebody entirely on the opposite side of your viewpoint. If you expect somebody to be absolutely perfect in line with you, and the minute they deviate from one of your viewpoints, you're just going to throw them to the wolves and call them a sellout and say they're horrible and terrible. I think that that's an ineffective strategy and an unrealistic approach to human nature and just the ugly kind of muddy process of being in government. You have to have people that, are they moving it more your way or are they not? And are you supporting them moving it your way, or are you just sitting back throwing bombs at them on Facebook and you haven't been to a single commission meeting in 3 years, you know, or something like that? I mean, there's a certain level of practical approach that I think activists just need to have. And whoever, people always come to me with their ideas, say, you need to do this, right? I get that all the time. Michelle, I know you get that too, and a lot of people get that. If you're an activist out there doing stuff and you're visible, then you always have people come up telling you need to do this, but they're not willing to do anything themselves. And that's one of the things that I think people need to look at. If there's a cause that matters to you, Glen Morgan doesn't have to take up your cause. If you know that issue and you've studied it and it's an important one for you, then focus on it. Start doing work on that issue, going out there, making things happen on that issue. Don't wait around for somebody else to take up your cause and be angry at the world because it's not suddenly changing when you're not doing anything to move the ball down the field yourself. Get involved and try to do it yourself. And it doesn't mean going out and doing crazy stuff. It just means trying to take a practical approach that's within your wheelhouse. One of the things we oftentimes do in political parties is we'll pick 7 different tasks, and then we'll assign somebody to fill every task, whether they hate it or not. And then we'll wonder why the people in attendance at our groups shrink, because the people have been assigned on a volunteer basis mostly to do all these tasks are doing something they hate or they're not even good at, and they don't want to do it, and they just shift into just fall away, right? You find people's passion and fit their passion to the tasks that they're trying to do. I mean, that's how you do it. People see my website or the campaign finance complaints I'm filing or the lawsuits or the chaos that I'm involved in, exposing government or corruption also. But I'm not completely alone. I mean, I might be the guy on the front, but there's a lot of people that support me in different ways. I have, shockingly enough, there's a lot of Democrats that I actively work with to help get information up from the inside, where you would think that how would any Democrat ever talk to Glen Morgan? Right? He's scorching the entire party, so why would anybody ever talk to him, right? I know I get that attitude a lot. But if But I'm willing to work with them because we happen to share common ground, at least in that little area, right? They want reform, they want to expose the truth, whatever it is. They work at a government agency, they want to tell the truth about what's happening there. And there's a lot of people that help in their own way because that's what they're passionate about and that's what they're good at. And they don't want to be the guy out front getting sued by Jay-Z Knight every other year. You know, they don't want to be the guy who's out there, you know, getting called names on Facebook. But they're willing to do the research so that I can put up a much better article than it would be otherwise because somebody spent the time to go through 5,600 pages of records requests, right, and pull out the important pieces of information so I could post it up in an article and expose the truth about what that government agency was doing. That's really valuable. They don't get the accolades and the praise, but that's valuable, and that's teamwork, and that's working together as a team, coming up and finding ways for people to do it. But you don't take the 5,600 pages and just dump it on somebody's lap who has no idea what they're looking at and doesn't care and doesn't want to go. They will not show up at your meeting next time. You know, they go away. So you find somebody that cares and you fit them. Yeah, I just think that's a good way of leading and managing teams. Loose affiliations. You know, it's very difficult for the other side to shut down what you're doing when they can't figure out how you're organized. You know, you're a loose, you know, affiliated sort of organization. There's not a big corporate headquarters. There's nothing. You don't have a big donor list. There's nothing for them to come after you, which I know was one of the reasons why they're mad at me a lot. Is that there's not a lot to grab there, right? Not a lot. I mean, they can attack me or whatever, but it's difficult. But I think it's not an ineffective way of organizing. If you're trying to change your community, trying to make a difference, the goal is what you're working towards, and then just try to find a way that's effective. And Libertarians should be pretty open to this approach. You know, it's about doing what fits, what you're interested in, and focusing on trying to make that change. Not being shoehorned into, you know, a round peg in a square hole and saying that's how we're going to make a difference. And adapt. Whatever plan you have, it will change on contact with the enemy. So no perfect plan's going to work, and you're just going to adapt. I may get a call driving home tonight that's going to change entirely what I write about next week because it's going to be a phenomenal piece of information, and I change the entire plan of what I had for next week because that's worth responding to or dealing with. And then I know we have somebody else, so I want to switch over, and then if we want to do Q&A, let's just save it all towards the end. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's what.
Okay, we'll just do that.
I was hoping maybe you could run through the
PDC stuff?
Just a quick.
You want me to do that right now?
I
can do that in.
Let's do it later, so we got.
I'll do it later. Let's do it later.
Could you repeat your website?
We the Governed.
address?
WeTheGoverned.com. It's going to look like that, and any of the articles you can log in and do sign up and get on the email just so you get the stories. I don't have advertising. I'm not paid to do it. I don't get paid any differently if 50 million people show up on the website or 10. I'm just trying to change. I'm just trying to get information out there. And the truth is, the more people who read it, then the more likely it is to get out there. And so I'm evangelizing the site, not because there's any money there associated with it for me. It's because that's the easiest way to get that information out there. So
We'll share that there on our event.
yeah, and I just want to encourage more people to take a look at that. So with that, I will hand it over, and I can do Q&A on anything after the fact, if that makes sense. So, all right.
Well, a lot of great information.
Yeah,
No
problem.
We could have had you talk for 5 hours.
Yeah, I'd be boring after that.
Thank you so much. So our next speaker now is Frank Bown, and he's going to talk to us a little bit about the balanced budget amendment that he's pushing for, as well as the Article 5 assembly.
It's all tied together.
And so he's going to talk to us a little bit about that. Frank helped me out quite a bit with my campaign in terms of doorbelling, and has been active in a variety of on a variety of different issues. So we kind of talked about the state level. He's going to talk about the federal level and how those sort of work together. So you're going to tie that into what Glenn said, and then we'll have a Q&A at the end. We've got quite a few people on the Facebook live feed too, so anyone with questions, go ahead and type them right in the message, and then for the Q&A, we will forward those to Frank and Glenn. Thanks so much, Frank,
Sure.
and I will let you have the floor.
Thank you, Michelle. And good evening, everyone. You all are familiar with the national debt, right? Which last count I think was, what, somewhat north of $21 trillion. I wonder, David, I wonder if I could, maybe I can put my notes over there.
Yeah.
You can just move that notebook there.
Just set it on the book. That'd be great.
Okay, sure. Yeah, well, yeah, the national debt, it's $21 trillion and growing at $1 trillion a year. And amazingly, nobody talks about this very much. They should, because that debt has some serious ramifications, which I hope to go into tonight. What I'm hoping to describe is not only the ramifications of the national debt, but also things that we, the American people, should be doing about it. Now, I mentioned that nobody talks about the national debt, and that because of that, the Washington, D.C. establishment, which nowadays is sometimes referred to as the swamp, it's basically a big corrupt favor factory for those who have the right connections. The D.C. Favor factory figures that it has a green light to just keep running up the national debt. And at the rate that's going, that's going to be a serious problem if we don't get that under control at some point.
Hey Frank,
Yep.
who has to pay that debt?
Well, a little later on, I'm going to get into just how that affects all of us. Yeah, and the case could be made that we all are paying for it right now in terms of harmful effects on the economy.
300 billion of that 1 trillion is the interest on it.
That's right. That's right. Give you a little quick calculation here. As Robert mentioned, the interest on the national debt, that's investment capital that's not available to grow the economy. Okay? And it takes investment capital growing the economy in order to invest in new plant and equipment, which creates new jobs, creates new goods and services, raises the standard of living, and keeps the economy growing. Let me just sidetrack here just a little bit. There's a figure that the classical economists like Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and so forth referred to as the surplus. That's the amount of wealth that a nation's economy can create in a given year over and above what is needed just to sustain the population. And economists for hundreds of years have studied the data on this and for trying to find out what is an average rate at which an economy can create this surplus. How much over and above what an economy needs just to sustain the population can be created. And it turns out that it averages about 3%. Now, interest rates in real terms also average about 3%. You see where I'm going with this? If our national debt gets to a point where it equals our gross domestic product, and right now our gross domestic product is about $19 trillion. Our national debt, even though it's $21 trillion, you really have to knock off about $5 trillion off of that, which is money that is owed to accounts like the Social Security Trust Fund and so forth that the federal government doesn't really have to pay interest on. All right? So we're down about $16 trillion. That means that $1 trillion a year, about another 3 years, and we're at a point where the national debt equals the gross domestic product, which means that the amount of surplus wealth that would otherwise be available for investment in growing the economy all has to go to pay interest on the national debt. Okay? When that point comes, I would guess that that's probably the tipping point where, and I mentioned this in a little handout that I put out here, that when that tipping point is reached, our economy is then locked in a state of permanent stagnation and decline. Okay? Other countries have gotten to that point. In fact, there was a famous study done by a couple of economists back east, Kenneth Rogoff of Harvard and Carmen Reinhardt of University of Maryland. They studied what happens when countries get locked into a debt spiral. And we're talking about countries like Greece. Glen mentioned a moment ago, Arne Mortensen, the Cowlitz County Commissioner that's from Venezuela. Venezuela is another example of a country that has been steered into a permanent downward spiral of debt. Okay, and I don't know if you've been following the news, but the implications of that on the population are incredible. There is no investment capital to do things like source goods to stock shelves in grocery stores, that sort of thing. People are reduced to having to slaughter their pet dog or pet cat to feed themselves. Crime is unbelievable. You know, they've become a society that is no longer ruled by anything close to a rule of law. Anyway, I want to, before I get a little too sidetracked here, I just want to make sure I cover a couple of important bases. We mentioned the Washington, D.C. establishment, the favor factory, the swamp, whatever you want to call it. Specifically, under the U.S. Constitution, the Congress has the three fiscal powers of the federal government. Those would be the power to spend money, the power to tax, and the power to borrow. And borrowing, of course, would be the difference, to make up the difference of whatever is needed to, if tax revenues fall short of expenditure, which, as I mentioned earlier, the shortfall currently is about $1 trillion a year. Now, the specific provision in the U.S. Constitution, it's in Article 1, Section 8, so Clause 2. It is the clause that gives Congress the power to borrow money on the credit of the United States. Notice that there is absolutely no limit on that line of credit. And that is the crux of the problem. There is nothing preventing Congress from borrowing whatever it wants in order to line the pockets of all the special interests in Washington, D.C., who in turn dole out the big campaign contributions to get people reelected to Congress, and also reward the relatives and cronies and whatnot of the members of Congress. It's just one big, one hand washing the other favor factory back there that has no financial limit, because there is no limit on Congress's ability to borrow money. Even Congress's ability to tax is somewhat limited, and Vice President Thomas Jefferson pointed this out in 1798. He said that if it came down to a choice between Congress being able to borrow or to tax, he would prefer prohibiting Congress's power to borrow. The reason is that there's only so much tax revenue that the government can squeeze out of an economy, okay? And also, Jefferson made the point that if you squeeze an economy too much, the taxpayers are going to vote out the members of Congress. How many of you are familiar with what's called the Laffer curve? Mm-hmm. Okay, it's a statistical analysis done by economist Arthur Laffer. And it shows that if you plot tax revenues against tax rates, as you raise tax rates, at first revenues will go up and up and up, but at some point in tax rates, the revenues start to decline. Okay? Now, in the United States, we're already on the downward sloping side of that Laffer curve. And so Congress really cannot raise any more tax revenue by raising rates.
Isn't it like 33%?
Yeah, I was gonna say, the
That's
sweet
right.
spot was 33%.
Yes,
Yep.
exactly, yep, yep. And so the out that Congress still has is the ability to borrow. That is the one door of the barn, or whatever metaphor you want to use, that is still wide open, and we have to get under control. Now, the article of the provision of Article 1, Section 8, that gives Congress the unlimited power to borrow money, as the Constitution is currently written. That provision could be amended in order to put limits on Congress's ability to borrow. And the way that would be done is through amending the Constitution. It would be just like the Constitution was amended in the early 1950s to limit the number of terms that the President of the United States could serve. All right? In the same way, an amendment to the Constitution could be adopted that would put limits, numerical limits, on the ability of Congress to borrow.
Would it be a dollar amount or a percentage?
Well, let me defer that just a little bit, Robert, because there are some really exciting scholarly efforts underway under some pretty prestigious institutions that are looking into questions like that. Let me talk just a little bit about the mechanism of how the Constitution can be amended. Amending the Constitution is provided for in Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution. And before we go any further, I'd like to just read Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution, except for a part that has been since amended away, that dealt with slavery, which of course got abolished by the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. Article 5, amending the Constitution. The Congress, whenever 2/3 of both houses shall deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to this Constitution, or on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states, shall call a convention for proposing amendments, which in either case shall be valid to all intents and purposes as part of this Constitution, when ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of the several states, or by conventions in 3/4 thereof, as the one or the other mode of ratification may be proposed by the Congress, provided that no state, without its consent, shall be deprived of its equal suffrage in the Senate. That mechanism for amending the Constitution that you noticed in the two different ways of proposing amendments, okay? One is having Congress propose the amendments. That's the way that all 27 of the existing amendments to the U.S. Constitution have historically been proposed. But there is that other method that says that on application of 2/3 of the state legislatures, that a convention will be convened that can propose an amendment. That is a way of bypassing Congress in order to get an amendment proposed that Congress otherwise would not propose. And think about it. An amendment that would limit Congress's currently unlimited power to borrow money, that's an amendment that Congress probably would not be willing to propose. And keep in mind, like Article 5 says, it takes a 2/3 vote in each house of Congress in order to propose an amendment. And so you can imagine that those self-serving members of Congress back there, it's probably going to be pretty tough to get 2/3 of them to let an amendment like this be proposed out to the states for ratification. So the other method that is of using the Article 5 convention for proposing an amendment is what my organization is all about. The framers of the Constitution were aware of the fact that Congress, in its self-serving, with its self-serving attitude, would probably block amendments like this that really need to be proposed, and so therefore they gave us this method whereby a reform could be imposed on Washington, D.C. from the outside. The specific effort that my organization is all about is the effort to get the state legislatures, 2/3 of the state legislatures, 2/3 of 50 is 34. The effort that my organization is all about is trying to get the necessary 34 state legislatures to call for a convention. And already we have 28 states, so we only need 6 more, or almost to the goal line. And ours would be a single topic convention called only to propose one possible amendment, and that is an amendment to require balanced federal budgets together with related and appropriate fiscal restraints. Unfortunately, there are groups on both the left and the right that are fighting us very hard. And let me just briefly explain the perspective, as I understand it, of both of those sources of opposition. On the left, you have groups like Common Cause, all of the public employees unions, etc. They don't want the federal budget to ever be balanced. They want the federal government to continue being, in effect, the borrower of last resort, to bail out cities and counties and towns, for example, that have holes in their budgets, perhaps, with federal grants brought to us by, people like U.S. Senator Patty Murray, for example. That's one of the things. Also, there are groups on the left that actually are pretty characteristic of a lot of the people on Wall Street, for example, that look to the federal government to bail out banks and whatnot. So, anybody that relies on federal government largesse wants federal borrowing to continue forever, so that there will be this endless stream of unlimited money that can be handed out to whoever has the best crony connections to Washington, D.C. On the right, there is this concern that arose in the 1960s and the 1970s when the effort to get a balanced budget amendment convention going was starting to pick up steam. And also there was another Article 5 convention effort that came about. That one came about as a result of abuse of power by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court tried to reach into state constitutions and tell the states that they had to apportion both houses of their legislature on a one-man, one-vote basis. You couldn't have, for example, state senators be, say, one per county, for example. The states immediately took that one to 32 states. Okay, so that's too short of the necessary 34 state threshold. At that point, the Washington, D.C. establishment, in the form of Arthur Goldberg, who later became a Supreme Court justice, some of the Kennedy family brain trust, Tip O'Neill, people like that, they foisted this myth that if the state legislatures formed a convention and proposed an amendment, rather than relying on Washington, D.C. to always propose amendments to the Constitution like it had always been done, that somehow that convention, that Article 5 convention, would somehow get drunk with its own novel power, would trash the entire Constitution, and first thing you know, we would have the end of our republic. Unfortunately, groups like John Birch Society, Eagle Forum, Philip Schlafly's organization, they took that and they ran with it, and they probably were successful in raising, you know, stirring up their members and raising a lot of money, getting a lot of motion going and so forth. But it's becoming more and more apparent to people that this really is something that is going to have to be done, given the fact that, as I said, we're probably just a few years away from the tipping point into a downward, never-ending debt spiral. And so their position is starting to look kind of thin. And so I don't have the time here tonight to go into all their arguments, but they're really a lot of far-fetched arguments. I would just leave you with a couple of points to keep in mind when you hear objections to this whole idea of using this Article 5 provision for the state legislatures to call a convention for proposing an amendment. I would ask you to just keep a couple of things in mind as to why that's important, and to why it's also safe too, that there really is nothing to be concerned about as far as the Article 5 convention destroying the republic. One would be that the Article 5 convention can only propose an amendment, okay, just like Article 5 says. Such a proposed amendment still have to be ratified, just as any amendment that Congress can already propose, which also subsequently has to be ratified. There's really no difference in that respect between this Article 5 convention and what Congress can already do. The other point to keep in mind is that it's really the question, can our nation survive much longer without using this reform procedure for imposing fiscal discipline on Washington, D.C. Keep in mind, as I mentioned earlier, the ramifications of a bankrupt nation. You know, history is replete with what happens to nations when they go bankrupt. The Weimar Republic of Germany was an example, which wound up with a totalitarian government as a result. Also, there are examples from current times. I mentioned Venezuela and Greece, for example, where the masses, you know, everyone except the upper 1% are absolutely desperate to survive. That's the outcome of a bankrupt nation. That's the outcome of a government steering its country into bankruptcy. I think I'll stop there and yeah, hopefully.
Thanks, Frank. I want to make sure that we have enough time for some Q&A.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I hope, you know, I hope that we can answer some of Robert's questions, because
and I have some questions.
yeah, I actually have about 4 or 5 items that are being kicked around in academic circles, scholarly circles, that are really pretty intriguing. Like, you know, bear in mind that the amendment that my organization is seeking, it doesn't just say, federal government, you have to balance your budget every fiscal year. You know, there's a lot of economists that are looking at this thing, saying, you know, let's expand that time frame out. Maybe you balance the budget over, say, a business cycle, for example.
So, Frank, I
yeah,
just have
sure.
a quick question for
Yeah.
you. What you're talking about seems a bit abstract and kind of 30,000 feet. Could you bring it down to, I mean, what does it mean to to me, and why would I feel passionate about supporting what you're trying to do here? I mean, what, is it gonna affect my pocketbook?
Yeah, well, again, I would say it comes down to a debt load that is too expensive for a nation to carry. And the expense of carrying that debt load grinds down the economy.
Is it affecting us now?
It doesn't, well, yeah, it's being hidden in the ways in which it affects
$300 billion
us.
being pulled out of the economy, $300 billion a year to pay the interest on that, and we're at record low interest.
So, I mean,
So-
tonight we're talking about taxes, how does that relate to taxes maybe?
Put
Well-
$300 billion back in the economy and into your pocket.
Yeah, you grow the economy, and also, too, keep in mind that a dollar borrowed today eventually is going to be a dollar increase plus the interest on that borrowed dollar in increased taxes.
So we're pretty much putting our kids in bondage.
That's right, yeah,
And grandchildren
yeah,
and great-grandchildren
Yeah.
and.
That's right.
Yeah,
in
yeah, this is
perpetuity.
destining the American people to be debt slaves.
Our generation is spending it, and we're enslaving our children.
And who's making the interest on that? Who's paid the interest? When you
China.
talk about
Oh,
the interest.
Right, yeah,
Where's
whoever,
that interest going?
yeah, whoever holds US government
Borrow
debt.
from China big time.
Yes, China
It's going to
currently
China, it's
holds,
going to Japan, it's going
yeah,
everywhere that lends us the money.
yeah. China currently holds about $1.5 trillion worth of US government securities.
Yeah.
The Arab oil sheiks, they hold quite a bit. Japan.
And
some.
why would a state legislature, because that's kind of what you're talking about, why would our Washington state legislature support this? How would it, I mean, what's the payoff for them, so to speak?
Well, the payoff for them is they're not going to have to
Cover
explain,
the
well, they're not going to have to explain to their constituents in a few years as to why they did nothing, why they allowed Washington, D.C. to take the nation's economy, including the economy of Washington State, down this endless debt spiral.
Because the states will have to deal with the ramifications.
Yeah, the social
you know,
implications, the economic
austerity
implications,
measures.
you betcha, the austerity. Yeah, there's really 4 possible outcomes to a hopeless debt crisis. You can see this in Greece, for example. You know, it either results in higher tax, you have to either get higher taxes, drastic cuts in government programs, okay, or jack interest rates to the sky in order to continue attracting capital to the government debt.
And risk deflation doing that.
Right, which then gets you deflation.
Yeah. Or all of the
Kills
above.
the economy. Or the 4th option is inflate away
Yeah.
part of the value of the debt. That's what the Weimar Republic of Germany tried.
There's been
See what-
municipalities in, wasn't it like Detroit or something? Or no, it was, I mean, major cities that declared bankruptcy and had to get a bailout. And the state of California is on that brink right now.
Yeah.
Michelle, to
Yeah.
answer your question, if you go to work and you get your paycheck and you look at the deductions, it doesn't say this, but it might as well. Those deductions, if they listed China, Japan, $75 to China, $50 to Japan, you're going to work for them. We are slowly becoming the slaves of that interest debt, and it's only going to get worse.
Yeah. When you do your tax return, okay, the second from the last page in the tax instructions booklet, okay, it describes the entire debt structure and the budget structure of the federal government. That's a very handy place to find
So
all
my
these
taxation
statistics.
is that Libertarian friends should be all over this.
Absolutely,
Oh, yeah.
absolutely,
Oh,
yes,
yeah.
yes,
There.
yes, yeah, because you see, what does government do with the money that it borrows?
Yeah.
It finances the deep state. It finances all these things we don't want the government to be doing, like, all this surveillance and whatnot. If you had this amendment, then Congress would be forced to do the same thing that any family or any business has to do.
Or
Yeah.
states.
Set priorities, yeah, and our state, 49 of the states
Yeah.
have prohibitions against running budget deficits.
So as a
And-
oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah,
I was gonna
and-
say, as a county party audience, what can people do locally to help with this effort? Because you've connected it to the state legislature a little bit. What sort of things can we do locally because we have a lot of legislators in King County.
Right.
What is kind of the battle
Yes.
plan
Okay.
that you would recommend for people who are passionate?
Two
about this?
things. One, study this handout sheet I gave you, this information sheet, okay? Go to our website, okay? Click on all the resource documents.
What is the website?
BBA4USA.org,
Okay.
all right? Go through all of the resource documents that are in there. There's a wealth of information. It goes all the way back to the founding era, et cetera. It's fascinating. You get yourself knowledgeable on this issue, all right? And then lobby your state legislators. Those two things. That's what I need you to do.
So for King County, is there any particular legislators or you want to talk off camera that we can share to say, hey, these are legislators that might be extra sympathetic to this, that need a hand, or things that we can help as grassroots activists?
Here's what it's looking like. Now, I didn't mention this, but we did start this proposal in the legislature this year. It was prime sponsored by Representative Kandata, and then 5 other representatives co-sponsored it. It's House Joint Memorial 4017. We just didn't, it came up it was kind of a last moment kind of thing, and we didn't really have, plus it was a short session, so we didn't really have time to really push it. But we're going to be reintroducing it next year. The senators that I've talked to, 1 or 2 of them have indicated to me that they think there's a pretty good chance they could get this thing through the Senate next year. In the House, if we got the entire Republican caucus, which
You have Fortunato on board?
talked to him a lot. It needs to be emphasized to him that he has told me that if somebody else will prime sponsor it, he will co-sponsor. Okay, and that's that's good.
So if you get me
I
elected,
need his
I
effort as
sponsor it.
well. I need some enthusiasm there.
So if you get me elected, I
Yes.
sponsor it.
There you are. Yep.
Have you talked to
Yep.
Rodney Tom? He's running in 48.
Not yet, but I intend to.
So as we're getting into election season, this sounds like it's a good issue where when we go to town halls, when we go
Yes.
to debates,
Yes.
ask this question,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Ask,
Yes.
will you
Yeah.
support a budget balance
Right.
amendment
Yeah.
that's coming
Yeah.
up?
Either support it now, or in a few years, your constituents are going to be wondering why you did not. When they're hurting from the stagflation, or whatever kind of course the economy takes, and it's going to be a downward course to misery for the masses. Their constituents are going to be wondering why they did not support this thing. So, that's your biggest argument. Yes.
I just want to touch on one thing, kind of to answer Michelle's question. Do you remember when Trump made cuts on the rates of taxes? And states like California, and I believe Washington too, said, well, we're going to raise our taxes to offset that. That's something that, how is that affecting us locally? And he had a
Yeah,
great
that's what I
point.
was thinking.
If we start acting locally, then
Yeah.
it'll have a, I guess, trickle up effect, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
But that was one thing that, when the president said, I'm gonna cut these rates, and he cut them below the sweet spot of that curve. I actually read a report on that, because like you were saying, you get revenue, but you hit that point, and
Right.
then the more you tax, the less revenue you get. So Trump put that back, in front of the sweet spot so he could maximize the amount of revenue he's getting. But then states stepped in and said, well, we're gonna offset that to kind of counteract what he did. And that's what we can do at the state level, is to say, oh, no.
Yeah, I think we need to be active at all levels, and I know.
Oh, true.
I really do, and especially, this is an issue that really engages, under our federalist system, okay? There's about 4 or 5 places in the U.S. Constitution where state legislators are actually given federal roles.
Yep.
Okay? And I think it's very important for any state legislature to state legislator to be aware of that. And this is one of those. This is one of the ways in which, you know, this one issue, it comes in at all levels of government.
Senators used to be appointed by the
right.
state legislators
Yes.
to give the states more say in the game.
Right.
And a lot of people are now re-examining the 17th Amendment.
Yeah, 17th Amendment took that away.
Yep.
So we're gonna get
Sure.
booted out of the restaurant in a bit, so
Oh.
I wanna